Hi, I'm Anna Yudin. I'm an author and also a doctor of clinical psychology. Today I want to talk about the very bizarre infighting between fiction and nonfiction lovers that I've been seeing on the internet. So as a lover of both fiction and nonfiction, imagine my surprise when I learned that this is a thing, that there are people basically making fun of each other because of the types of books that they enjoy, specifically whether they read fiction or nonfiction. And so in this video, I thought it might be interesting to look at the research on this topic. Since, like I said, I'm also a doctor of psychology, I was curious about, is there any truth to this infighting? Is one side better than the other? So that's what we'll dive into today. I'll also give you my own personal beliefs, and let's get into it.
I'm not being overdramatic when I say that I would rather sit naked on a hot grill than wear something off the rack.
Ugh. Brother, ugh. What's that? What's that, brother?
Here are some self-help books you should never read. As a disclaimer, I think the entire self-help industry is a scam, but these are the worst offenders.
Oh, no.
If you want to become a better person, then ditch the self-help book stock that you have in your nightstand and start reading fiction instead.
I will say I noticed the majority of the TikToks that I saw about this were people who love fiction making fun of people who love nonfiction. There was only one case that I saw of somebody who reads nonfiction openly speaking about disliking fiction. I think this is the perfect example of what we call a false dichotomy, a logical fallacy in which two things are pitted against each other, and we see that there are only two options when in reality there are a lot more than just two. It's not just either you read fiction or you read nonfiction. A person can read both fiction and nonfiction. Case in point, pitting two ideas against each other that are absolutely not opposites and can coexist is a fallacy. It's simply not true. For me, when I decide on what book I'm gonna read next, it's honestly a very frustrating process because I feel like it sucks that I have to pick one over the other. I only like to really take it one at a time. I want to read as much nonfiction as possible because I'm curious about a lot of different topics, about different areas of research, about different areas of self-improvement. And I also want to read nonfiction because it's fun and it's interesting, and honestly, it helps me a lot with my writing. So I've been trying recently, when I'm working on a novel, to mainly focus on fiction, and when I'm not writing a novel, to mainly focus on nonfiction for my own self-development and for ideas for my YouTube channel, my psychology channel. So who reads what? What does the research say about who prefers different types of genres? So there's this stereotype that men tend to prefer nonfiction and women tend to prefer fiction. But interestingly, studies show that avid male readers prefer fiction over nonfiction. And when boys prefer nonfiction, it might be the result of socialization through gender stereotypes, because we have this image of fiction as something girly, like women do, because they like to be more empathic and to sort of dive into the worldview of these characters. Research has also found that children with autism spectrum disorder prefer fiction to nonfiction. Let's start with the research on reading fiction, what ways it can be helpful. So there's one meta-analysis that found that fiction reading has a small positive impact on social cognition, even compared to nonfiction reading as well as to not reading. So fiction is better for social cognitive development compared to either not reading or to reading nonfiction. Social cognition is how people process, store, and apply social information, basically figuring out why people do what they do, learning to read the room, skills like that. So as the theory goes, reading fiction allows you to simulate social content, like dialogue, interactions between characters, and it plays a role in your ability to practice social cognition out in the real world. It's almost like a practice run. You're using imagination to imagine how you might respond in certain social situations. In that sense, it's almost like dreaming. Dreaming has a similar function often, where the person who is dreaming is practicing how they might react in different situations. When you're reading these social issues in fiction, it's a way to practice theory of mind. Theory of mind is this idea that develops in childhood of other people have different motives and different perspectives, different beliefs in life, different traits. Not everybody is like me, not everybody thinks like me. And as you can imagine, when you're embedded in a work of fiction, you get to see how the protagonist thinks in person feels about things. You get to learn about the other characters. And so if you're not a person that has a lot of social practice in your real life, reading fiction can be a really good way to sort of practice those muscles. Reading literary fiction compared to nonfiction or popular fiction enhances the reader's performance on theory of mind tasks. And kind of related to theory of mind is empathy. You need theory of mind to sort of empathize. And empathy was also shown to be improved by fiction reading. Fiction exposure predicts performance on empathy tasks. I mean, like I said, it makes sense, right? You're reading about people who are different from you all the time, what makes them tick, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. The fact that everybody's so different, you're learning to have compassion for imperfect characters. All of this is bound to have a positive effect on empathy. Reading fiction can also help personality growth and maturation. But here's the thing, there was this study I found that said more empathy, but at what cost? Sort of talking about, I guess, the shadow side of the more empathy that reading fiction gives you. And the author says, a possible disadvantage for readers of fiction. The use of the brain circuitry that supports mentalizing and empathy while reading may also result in reality monitoring errors, meaning avid readers of fiction may experience difficulties in separating experientially based knowledge from that which has been derived from fiction. The paper concludes with a discussion of two specific difficulties for fiction readers stemming from reality monitoring deficits. First, readers of fiction may misapply schemas used in fiction to people and events in the actual perceived world. Second, people may incorrectly apply inferences made while reading fiction to the empirical world, even under circumstances in which such inferences are not warranted. I guess this makes sense, and I have heard from some people, especially people that read a lot of romance, a lot of women say that they tend to compare their partner in real life to fictional men that they've read. So I guess that makes sense, kind of like misapplying what you read in fiction to the real world. But I will say, like, this study did bother me a little bit because it kind of makes it sound like fiction readers are incapable of reality testing and incapable of understanding that what they read in fiction is sometimes different from what happens in the real world. You know, like fiction readers are able to compartmentalize. We're not that vulnerable and that gullible. Reading fiction has also been shown to help improve longevity. There's evidence that reading a book for 30 minutes every day predicts 20% lower odds of dying about a decade later. And this is actually an advantage over reading the newspaper every day instead, which is arguably a form of nonfiction. All right, but what about the research on nonfiction? What are the benefits and disadvantages of that? So this is actually not as well studied as I would have expected, with the exception of a few school settings. Usually nonfiction is just kind of pitted against fiction in studies, which I don't love. And the hypothesis for those is usually related to social cognition and empathy. And in those cases, it's clear that fiction has an advantage. But there is some research on it. So nonfiction helps readers develop content area knowledge, meaning you learn about different aspects of whatever you're reading. Nonfiction also gives you the opportunity to think critically about what you're reading. You know, fiction doesn't quite set up an argument in quite the same way, although I guess you would say maybe like themes are kind of the argument of fiction, but they're usually not very apparent, whereas with fiction, it's very much you make an argument and then you gather evidence to support your argument. Nonfiction also builds vocabulary, it connects students to real-world questions, and it assists in cross-curricular learning. I appreciate this, you know, as a person that hasn't learned, for instance, about medicine or about spirituality. Whenever I read sort of a self-help book that combines those areas with psychology, I find that to be a treat because I get to learn about other aspects while using my knowledge that I already have in a different field. Also, in one of the studies that pitted fiction against nonfiction, they found that exposure to nonfiction was associated with loneliness and negatively related to social support. Since it's behind a paywall, I can't really go in and see why they theorize this might be, but it's definitely unusual for me. So here's my personal perspective on this. Like I said, I love fiction because it helps me become a better writer and because it's fun. I love nonfiction because it helps me learn a lot of information. I mean, I've learned so much more supplemental knowledge based on, yes, psychology, but also financial matters, spirituality, self-development, research studies that I otherwise wouldn't have known about, learning from experts in their field. I love to read books who are written by like big researchers in whatever the book is about. And also I feel like you can become a better person because of reading nonfiction. It has really helped me become a more tactful, compassionate, efficient, resilient, ambitious person. I mean, who I am today is in large part because of a lot of the nonfiction books that I've read over the past few years. And reading nonfiction can also help you learn about real life people. The author can serve as a role model, especially if you're like missing certain role models in your life. Like maybe you don't have like a big sister or you don't have like a dad or something. The author can serve as like an honorary role model for that role that's missing. But I've heard a lot of hate on nonfiction, and from what I understand, people's reasons are that it makes them feel like they're not doing enough, like they constantly have to be self-improving, and they struggle to apply the insights learned to their own life. I'm going to be honest with you, I think there are workarounds for these issues, and I don't think it's fair to put these issues on nonfiction as the genre. It's not enough to just read a work of nonfiction and then it's going to completely change your life and transform you. You have to take notes, you have to reflect on how am I going to apply this knowledge to my own personal life. You have to take actionable steps, you have to give yourself exercises and practice and homework. Teaching it to somebody else is always super helpful. That's why talking about stuff that I've read in nonfiction books on my psychology channel has really helped me ingrain that knowledge. At the end of the day, nonfiction is not going to fix your life. No, you have to be the one to make use of that information in constructive ways. But if it's not for you, then you don't have to read it. There's no reason to hate on people that do find it helpful or to act like the entire genre as a whole is so terrible. I never quite understand when somebody throws the baby out with the bathwater. Like if they say, well, I've read these 5 self-help books and they made me feel bad and they were terrible, and so the whole genre is terrible. It doesn't have to be so black and white. It doesn't have to be indicative of the entire genre, the entire category that it belongs to. Not all nonfiction is created equal. Some nonfiction is written by titans in their field, other nonfiction is written by people that really don't know what they're talking about. Some is life-changing, like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and some is maybe not so life-changing, like We Should All Be Millionaires, for instance. If you as a fiction reader are so against nonfiction, you might want to lean into the stereotype about fiction readers as empathic and use empathy a little bit and think about, how would I feel if somebody were saying that all of fiction is terrible and pointless based on just a couple of bad fiction books that they've read? I wouldn't feel fair, right? That would feel kind of sucky. And I think it's great that fiction has become so normalized again in this culture, but we also need to be mindful to not skew too far to the other side where we're starting to shame people for enjoying different things like nonfiction. Like I said, if you don't like nonfiction, then just don't read it. What do you think about this subject? Pop it down in the comments. I'll see you soon.